Okay, so we often talk about the original intent of the writers of the Constitution, but the founding fathers did not plan to create the political system we have today, a democratic republic based on two national and permanent political parties. Now, indeed, democracy and political parties were dirty words to them. They did realize, however, that the world was likely to change, which is one reason they included an amendment process in the Constitution that has allowed this document to survive as our frame of government for so long. So in today's discussion, in lecture, we're going to be talking about whether or not the Constitution actually created a democracy and what our founding fathers, maybe what some of their intents were. So to begin, we're going to talk a little bit about some historical views of the Constitution. So the Constitution was not the original frame of government of the newly independent United States. The states were originally governed by the Second Continental Congress, and then from 1781 to 89 by the Articles of Confederation. Now, in the late 19th century, historians saw these articles as a disastrous failure, engendering the critical period concept in which the infant and endangered United States was saved by the godlike founding fathers. That interpretation was questioned by early 20th century historians who argued that the Constitution was the response of moderates protecting their own economic and class interests. In this view, the Constitution was an anti-democratic and counter-revolutionary document. Now, in turn, that interpretation came under attack in the mid and late 20th century, and many historians today view the Constitution as a continuation, not an antithesis of the Revolution. And as you read through your Patriots' history and your people's history, I'll let you come to your own conclusions on whether or not which or whose side, who is on which side of this argument, on whether or not the role and the historical view of the Constitution. Now, just a little bit of review about the process of about the Articles of Confederation. So let's look here to see kind of what they did here. So the process of creating governments began in the 1770s, as mentioned in the previous lectures, as the colonial assemblies transformed themselves into state legislatures and governments. Now, this process would involve a rejection of the British concept of balanced government in favor of overwhelming legislative power, and a move from unwritten to written constitutions, which is somewhat ironic when you consider our government today. The first thing people say when they say, what type of government do we have? We say balance of powers. But that was not the original form of government in the United States. Now, at first, the central government was the Second Continental Congress. The Articles of Confederation meant to serve as a bridge between the Congress and a federal government, and were presented to the states in 1777, but not ratified by all until 1781. Largely because the states retained their distrust of both centralized power and one another as well. Now, the article set up a central government of sorts, but a weak one, with no executive or judiciary, no power to tax or enact any important measures without a two-thirds vote, and no power to change the structure without unanimity. Each state had one vote, and thus a virtual veto power. And this organization was established very consciously. The states saw themselves as independent republics, retaining sovereignty and joining into a loose confederation, something like the United Nations. They feared centralized power and sought to guarantee their liberty through decentralization and state legislatures. Now, we often look at the failures of the articles, but there were some successes as well. Now, despite these inherent weaknesses of this frame of government, much was accomplished under the articles, including, of course, the winning of the independence and a favorable peace treaty in 1783, with the western boundary for the United States all the way to the Mississippi River. Now, state governments were also established under the Articles, with many social and political reforms, including the extension of the franchise, frequent elections. As we said, every year the politicians would have to run for elections, and the separation of church and state. Now, The pattern for Western expansion and settlement was also established with the Northwest Ordinances of 1784, 85, and 87, and internationally speaking, the Articles opened trade with the European powers in Asia. And I included this map here to look at. One of the things your textbook, the Patriots History, talks about is this latitudinal design of the states. And there were some problems under the Articles and even in the Constitution about where would this land, who would get this land as you continued to go west, as the western border changed from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi. And as this map points out here, if you take a look at the different states, we've got Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland and Pennsylvania. And as you move west, you can see these states have the opportunity to expand their territory all the way to the Mississippi. Now, these were the large states, and of course we continue to have this large state, small state debate. But as we get into the smaller states up north, and even the large states up north like New York, Maine, Massachusetts, they're incapable of continuing to go west because they have Canada and these lakes in the way. So this became a big problem, and one of the things that the article set up was how to divvy up this land in the west, and then eventually how to take this land from the west, and the federal government takes this land and then sells it back to the people for revenue. And we'll talk about that. Your textbook talks about that more in detail. Now, of course, there were some problems with the Articles, and by 1787, these problems appeared to outweigh successes. The Confederate Congress had no power to tax, and thus to pay for a military force or pay its debts. And the nation's military power rested essentially with untrained and unreliable state militias. And this translated into a lack of power in foreign affairs and a lack of respect from European nations. Now, there was also a post-war economic depression, which was also blamed on the Articles. And to halt land foreclosures, states began to repudiate debts and print paper money, causing inflation. And such measures were easy to enact because there was little or no check on legislative powers in the states. So some states established their own currencies and trading systems, causing a breakdown in interstate relations and presenting the danger that states would turn to European allies for intervention. Now, with Shays' Rebellion, a march of 1,200 men on the Supreme Court in Massachusetts and on an arsenal, fear of anarchy spread. Now, no national army was available to halt the rebellion, and although the state militia did, it could just have easily failed from lack of training or even join the revolt. Now, these problems convinced many that the national government was incapable of defending the liberty won during the Revolution, and that a new frame of government was necessary. And note that the definition of liberty here was not democracy, but individual freedom from tyranny, either from above or below. And the Revolution had fought successfully for liberty and against tyranny from above, but the threat now seemed to be tyranny from below, mob rule, as in Shays' Rebellion, these farmers that were the lower of the social standings that were rebelling against the government and against the nation. And with the danger of European intervention and the possible destruction of the Republican experiment, tyranny from above had not been eliminated either. So we have this fear of tyranny from below, the mob, and tyranny from above, European governments. So in 1787, the Constitutional Convention met. A special convention was called to revise and strengthen the Articles of Confederation. Revolutionary leaders Benjamin Franklin and George Washington were present, but aside from these two, most of the delegates were quite young. Many were veterans of Washington's Continental Army or the Continental Congress, which gave them a national as opposed to a state outlook. Now, the representatives were simultaneously conservative and revolutionary. They were men of property who feared democracy and mob rule as destructive of liberty, but they were also revolutionaries who desired to create something new, a republic with centralized power to preserve rather than destroy liberty. And their basic dilemma was this: how to create a government strong enough to preserve liberty from the tyranny of the mob or European monarchs without giving it enough power to be tyrannical itself. And in the 51st Federalist paper, James Madison even noted, he says, "A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government. Thus, the Constitution begins, "We the people." Sovereignty rests, "We the people." Now, the Constitution, as you read or have read in the Constitution, separates sovereignty from rule via a series of intermediaries and divides power among those intermediaries to avoid tyranny. And we know this system as checks and balances, and it exists on two levels: separation of powers among the three branches of the national government, and division of powers between the national government and the state governments. Now, the founders returned to the concept of balanced government, as opposed to the state constitution writers in the beginning, because of the perceived excesses and weaknesses of existing legislative governments. They sought to combine elements of a monarchy, an aristocracy, and a democracy within the new national government. So the president would be a monarch indirectly elected by the electoral college by elite electors, the aristocracy, with a 4-year term and powers limited to those enumerated in Article 2 of the Constitution. The Senate would be an aristocratic branch, indirectly elected by the people through the state legislatures, with a 6-year term and the powers listed in the first article of the Constitution. And the national judiciary would also be aristocratic as well. And the House of Representatives would be a democratic branch with short terms, albeit still with property qualifications for voting. Now, as we know, each branch has the power to check the others. For example, the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but Congress appropriates funds for the military and declares war. The new national government had enormous powers, but it did not have a monopoly on power. The 10th Amendment explicitly reaffirmed that all powers not delegated to the new national government are prohibited by it to the states would be reserved to the states, each capable of checking the other. So they found a way to balance the power of the central government with the state governments. Now, the constitutions, in essence, set up a large republic, something that, according to political theory of the day, could not survive. In the 10th Federalist Paper, in fact, Madison turned this theory on its head, claiming that a republic in a large area had a better chance of preserving liberty than one in a small area. Now, for Madison, factions were the key problem in sustaining a republic. In a democracy, a majority faction, a group willing to ride roughshod over the rights of others to ensure its own interests, could easily gain control and destroy liberty. Such factions cannot be abolished without abolishing liberty, but they must be controlled via checks and balances. A large republic can do this better than small ones because the greater population and area resulted in more factions and a reduced chance that one would dominate. So that was Madison's argument as to why a large republic could work. And looking historically at what was happening, the founding fathers, the only example of a republic they had been ancient Rome, which we all know today is no longer around and crashed and burned in the 1st century. So it's no wonder they were kind of fearful of this idea of a republic, considering it was the first time it had been done in thousands of years. Now, there was a lot of disagreement at the convention, which you had mentioned in some of the debates that we talked about in the previous lecture. Despite agreement on certain essentials, disagreements among the delegates almost wrecked the convention. Now, major disputes pitted large states against small ones over the issue of representation, and northern states against southern on some issues related to slavery. Delegates also were also split over just how much power to give the national government at the expense of the states. Now, some delegates also feared that despite the checks and balances, the new national government had too much power. Only 39 of 55 delegates actually signed the final document. Now, the Constitution also called for special state ratifying conventions, with ratification by 9 states required to put the document into effect. Intense opposition emerged in virtually every state, primarily from established groups who controlled state governments and feared centralized power. Now, this was actually a good tactic on the part of those who wanted the Constitution to be passed. So, previously, according to the Articles of Confederation, for the states to change anything with the Articles, they would meet in their normal state legislatures and they would have a vote, and every state, all 13, would have to agree unanimously. What the Constitution set up was it actually set up a separate assembly, specifically for constitutional issues, for the federal Constitution, circumventing the state legislatures, which were usually entrenched with aristocrats or people that had been in control for a very long time. And it only allowed 60% or about 9 out of 13 to actually for it to pass to become law. The pro-Constitution forces won the struggle for, like I said, for these reasons. The ratification bypassed state legislators, and further, the Federalists also agreed to address a key anti-Federalist objection: the lack of a specific Bill of Rights. Creating one would be the first order of business under the new government. So not only did they win with the new ratification assemblies, they also said, well, if the Anti-Federalists are arguing over the lack of a Bill of Rights, we'll just include one, which allowed more people to vote on their side. Now, the final version of the Constitution and the Federalist Papers show the founders as Hobbesian realists who distrusted human nature and sought to stop what they considered the excesses of revolution. And in that sense, they can be viewed as conservative, even counter-revolutionary. Simultaneously, however, they were still Lockeans and revolutionaries who wanted to preserve the Republican experiment against what they considered clear and present dangers, and were willing to try a radical and unprecedented experiment to do so. Now, the founders succeeded in establishing a new frame of government, but in the process, they left a series of unanswered questions that would cause a split among them within a few years and would be bequeathed to their successors later on down the road. So this concludes this lecture on the whether or not the Constitution is considered democratic, and hopefully you can see how the removal of some actual democratic processes, for example, directly electing a president or directly electing a legislator, can sound pretty non-democratic, but in fact it leads to a lot of problems in this whole democratic idea. And then in the next lecture, I'm actually going to talk a little more about Hobbes and Locke and the philosophers in England and France who really influenced the revolutionaries during the Revolutionary War, and also the writing of the Constitution. And it's important to mention these because the problems that occur in France after these writers wrote, and including after the French Revolution, caused a lot of problems in France and a lot of problems in the early Republic as to which side they should be fighting on.